Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Emma Duncan, The Economist's Britain editor. Britain's Office of Prime Minister was created 300 years ago this month, sort of, because like so many other things in this country, the job emerged incrementally and rather sneakily. It's dated to April 1721 because that's when Robert Walpole assumed the job of First Lord of the Treasury, and a great deal of power with it, after he'd managed to keep his nose clean during the collapse of the South Sea bubble. We've invited you to decide who the greatest Liberal Prime Minister of the past 300 years was, because The Economist is a liberal paper. We're not liberals in the American sense, which identifies liberalism with progressivism and a more interventionist state. We're talking about classical liberalism, the sort that emphasises freedom in the economy, in personal life and in thought. Among our Prime Ministers, we've selected as our top liberals Robert Peel and William Gladstone from the 19th century, David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher from the 20th. And each of them has a powerful defender. Daniel Hannan, who's the Conservative Party's international ambassador, serves on the Board of Trade and is president of the Initiative for Free Trade, is representing Robert Peel. Margaret Macmillan, Professor of History at the University of Toronto, is representing David Lloyd George. Adrian Wooldridge, Political Editor at The Economist, is representing Winston Churchill. Charles Moore, journalist and former editor of the Daily Telegraph, is the authorised biographer of Margaret Thatcher, who he is representing. Now, we're hoping that Michael Gove, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Minister for the Cabinet Office, will be representing William Gladstone. He's been caught up with some urgent parliamentary business, of which the government has quite a lot at the moment. So we have an excellent standby in the form of Duncan Weldon, The Economist's economics correspondent, in case he doesn't make it. This is a balloon debate, which involves chucking participants out of the basket in two different rounds. Our participants will speak about their Prime Minister for 5 minutes, then we'll have 20 minutes of questions from the audience, and then a vote. At that point, we'll keep two of our Prime Ministers in the basket, and the two remaining participants will have another 3 minutes each to launch a final energetic defence of their candidates. And then we'll have another vote. So, first up, Daniel Hannan, can you tell us, please, why Robert Peel is Britain's greatest Liberal Prime Minister?
Thank you. Peel was in the first rank of 19th century statesmen. He carried Catholic emancipation, he repealed the Corn Laws, he created the modern Conservative Party on the ruins of old Toryism. So wrote A.J.P. Taylor, who was not by any stretch of the imagination an ideological sympathiser either of Sir Robert or indeed of the classical liberal principles we just heard adumbrated. But in Taylor's formulation, you see the basic disadvantage that Robert Peel is under in a debate of this kind. He is by far the most remote from us in time. And as a result, it can be difficult to grasp the magnitude of his accomplishment. When we modern people think of Catholic emancipation, the extraordinary thing to us is not that it passed, but that it ever needed to pass in the first place. And by the way, I say we modern people very loosely. That was a point made by The Economist's own Walter Bagehot in his famous essay on Peel in 1856, a mere 27 years after the passage of the Emancipation. So that's the basic problem that we have in a balloon debate, we Peelites. But let me put before you, ladies and gentlemen, three achievements of such benign vastness that I think they dwarf what followed. First, Robert Peel created the idea of the policeman as an unarmed citizen in uniform with no more power than you or me, except insofar as those powers might be temporarily bestowed on him by a magistrate. Second, Robert Peel created the modern Conservative Party as a liberal, moderate, and democratic force. And third, he abolished the Corn Laws and indeed a number of other tariffs and trade restrictions, thereby elevating Britain to the highest pinnacle of wealth with a particularly benign impact on people on low income. So I want to take those in order, starting with the police. You don't have to look very far to see police forces which are regarded as agencies of, if not always repression, at least of state power. The fact that we have the friendly and open relationship between British bobbies and the British public is, as that affectionate nickname recalls an achievement of the man who created the Metropolitan Police as Home Secretary. Peel was, I think all contemporaries acknowledged, the greatest administrator of his generation. And it was his brilliant mind that set out the 9 principles which policing has been governed by since. Principles that I think still work today, that prevention is better than repression, that the authority of the police depends on public confidence, that persuasion and warning are always to be preferred to physical force, and that it's not for the police to usurp the functions of the judiciary and to seek to establish guilt or innocence. Look even at what's happening in countries as close to us culturally as the United States, and you will see that we have cause to be cheerful to the generous-minded Lancastrian. Creation of the Conservative Party. Now, this one might seem obvious for those watching who are Conservative supporters. Oldest and most successful party in discovered space. But what about the many, probably the majority watching, who are not Conservative supporters? Why should you regard the creation of the Conservative Party in 1834 as an achievement? Well, let me put it like this, as a Conservative myself. I have often felt cause to be grateful for the character of our chief left of centre party in this country. I've written many times that you don't have to look far to see leftist parties that are steeped in bloodshed and revolution, that thought that they would only be successful when the last king had been strangled with the bowels of the last priest. That was not the tradition of our Labour Party, which was born rather in working men's libraries and nonconformist churches and the temperance movement and brass bands and so on. I would ask you, non-conservatives, to apply a similar test to our chief right of centre party. Compare it throughout most of the 19th century to what conservatism was in France, in Spain, in Germany, in Russia. You will find there that the character of conservatism tended to be autocratic, authoritarian, obscurantist, illiberal, and anti-democratic. The fact that we have a Conservative Party prepared to move with the times goes back to the Tamworth Manifesto, where, as Peel wrote in inspired language, he was appealing to that great and intelligent class of society, less interested in the contentions of party than in the maintenance of order and the cause of good government, and which promised the correction of proved abuses and the redress of real grievances. Finally, and most impressively, free trade. Has any policy done more to elevate and enrich our species? Removing barriers between businesses and their customers ended the racket whereby the poor were subsidizing the rich. It was Peel's achievement that led to Britain being elevated above the run of nations. Victorian visitors from overseas were always struck by the extraordinary standard of living of the poorest people in this country, because free trade, it was a difficult argument to win then, it's still a difficult one to win now. Free trade, although it benefits everyone, benefits those on low incomes the most. And it was extraordinary that Peel, in pursuit of that enrichment, destroyed the party that he'd created, put it out of office for a generation, paid a price that none of the other candidates tonight, with the partial exception of Gladstone on Home Rule, came close to paying. So Peel, the man who took us from an aristocratic, mildly corrupt ancien regime into a modern meritocracy, offers us Gladstone's high-mindedness without his pomposity. He offers us Thatcher's drive without her stubbornness, her occasional humorlessness, Churchill's extraordinary patriotism and belief in this country without the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the second term. Indeed, Peel's second term was arguably the most successful of any prime minister ever. He offers us Lloyd George's charisma without his genial corruption. And on the subject of the priapic little Welshman, it's worth just noting parenthetically that Peel was a model as a husband and father. His relationship with his wife Julia was a deeply beautiful love story. When he died, the Times, again, not a natural supporter, had the following to say. Under Providence, Peel has been our chief guide from the confusions and darkness that hung around the beginning of this century to the quiet haven in which we are now embayed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, is the true magnitude of his achievement. All of the other candidates tonight enlarged liberty, all of them were able to function in a polity which elevated the individual above the collective and which elevated the rules above the rulers. But it was Sir Robert Peel who created that polity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. That was really powerful, really interesting. And some of it, at least the bits about personal life, you might not be able to say about the current incumbent of number 10. Margaret, could you tell us why David Lloyd George is your man, please?
I will. And of course, because I've spent a great deal of my life teaching, I will start out sounding very much like a teacher and say that I enjoyed Daniel Hannan's talk a great deal. But I think he could have done a bit more to define his terms. And I'm going to challenge both his definition of liberalism as I understood it, and I'm afraid I'm a bit the one that you had. Liberalism is not just about freedom. It's not just about absence of restraint. It's not just about free trade. Liberalism has a core set of values. It's principled, but it's practical. It's open to change. It challenges accepted ideas and practices. It believes in experimentation. It has faith in human beings and progress. But it has, for all that, core values. It believes in liberty for individuals and for peoples, but that liberty must have a purpose. As John Stuart Mill said, liberty is there so that human beings can develop their potential to its fullest. So liberalism is not libertarianism. Libertarianism has appropriated the name, but not the principles, I think, without understanding them. Liberalism, yes, involves constitutional government and the rule of law, and we could argue that Sir Robert Peel, in that at least, was a liberal. It believed that the state should protect individuals in the society in which they live. It believed also in international peace and progress, and it believed in working towards that. But liberals being liberals, although they believed that free trade could often further international peace and progress, they didn't believe it was a shibboleth. They didn't believe that it was something that could not be challenged. When necessary, liberals could become protectionists. They could believe in protecting fledgling industries. They could believe in protecting those who were being disadvantaged by free trade. And so when we look at Lloyd George, it seems to me that he has those qualities, if you accept my definition of liberalism as something that is changing, that is progressive, that looks towards the best side of human nature, that believes in progress. Lloyd George had that. He was both a liberal in that sense, but he was also a great prime minister. He was a great leader who could speak to and for British society. He was also enormously practical. He was a great administrator. He was flexible in his methods. He brought business, labor leaders, experts together to try and improve government. And crucially, he was willing to change his mind. He was willing to ask difficult questions. He challenged the Navy during the First World War when it didn't want to do convoys. He insisted, and the amount of shipping being sunk went down. He was an outstanding peacetime minister, an outstanding Chancellor of the Exchequer, and of course, equally outstanding in war. And that capacity to function both in peace and war, I think, is a mark of his greatness. He was an extraordinary minister of munitions. He transformed production. He kept peace between workers and owners. He became prime minister at the darkest time, I think, for the British and for the Allies in December 1916. And he brought Britain together and helped to bring it to a successful victory. We've too long, I think, been affected by Keynes's ridiculous view of this strange half goat, half human being who came out of the mists of Wales with no moral core at all. It was an absurd sketch, I think about as absurd as the priapic little Welshman, which seems to me a typical sort of English way, if I may say so, of dismissing someone who challenged a number of the certainties. There were consistent threads in Lloyd George's policies and his life. He was anti-privilege, he was anti-oppression, he was anti-injustice. He had a horror of war. He believed in making reforms so that individuals in the poorer classes could have the opportunities and the decent lives that poverty denied them. He believed in education. He believed in unemployment insurance, old age pensions. The liberty, as he often pointed out, liberty and rights of the individual are not much good if you're starving and you can't get food and medicine for your children. And so he directed British society in the direction of greater fairness, and he laid the foundations of the welfare state. As an international statesman, he had hopes for the empire. He believed that it was moving towards greater self-government, towards greater cooperation. He saw it moving into becoming not so much empire, but a commonwealth of nations. And he brought together the Dominion prime ministers in the course of the war as equals to sit in the Imperial War Cabinet and to try and plan for the victory that was to come and for the peace that was to come. He believed in the peaceful settlement of disputes, but again, of course, being a liberal, he was practical. He also believed that it was necessary to keep up your defenses. When he went to Paris post-1918 to make the peace that was hoped that was going to bring a new world order, he dedicated himself to that. He believed in the rights of small nations. He had pushed, of course, for Irish Home Rule before the war and was able to bring it to a successful conclusion after the war. He tried in the face of enormous odds to build a lasting peace. He was a supporter of the League. He believed in the 1920s in bringing both Bolshevik Russia and a defeated Germany back into the community of nations. So was he a liberal prime minister? Yes, he was. And I don't want to be unfair to the Tories and Labour and leave them out of the competition. And so I will say that he was not just a liberal prime minister, not a great liberal prime minister, which he was, but he was also one of the greatest of British prime ministers in both peace and war. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, very much. And Adrian, can we have the other wartime prime minister from you?
Indeed, in 1962, when Churchill was in his 80s and very infirm, he found himself in a lift in the House of Commons with a new MP that he didn't recognise, who was called Bill Malaloo, otherwise known as Curly. Who are you, said Churchill. Curly gave his name and said that he was the MP for Huddersfield. What party, said the great man. Labour, said Curly. Remember, these were the days when the Labour Party could win seats in the north of England. Said Churchill, I'm a liberal, always have been. And I think basically Churchill was always a liberal, either as a big L liberal or a small L liberal. He went into politics initially as a conservative, and then crossed over to the Liberal Party and worked very closely with Lloyd George in constructing the basic building blocks of the modern welfare state. He even discussed at great length with Lloyd George the idea of creating a new centrist anti-socialist party, a sort of fusion based on all the talents. He then, when he left the Liberal Party, first stood for Parliament as a liberal anti-socialist, an independent anti-socialist. He then went back to the Conservative Party and spent the rest of his life there, becoming a Conservative Prime Minister. But he was always on the liberal anti-appeasement wing of the Conservative Party. He always saw the world through the eyes of a sort of 19th century classical liberal. For example, he supported very strongly creating a state for the Jewish people in Palestine, and he saw this really as a sort of the second act of the Risorgimento in many ways. He was a sort of rooted in 19th century liberalism. Evelyn Waugh complained that when he was prime minister after the Second World War, he didn't set the clock back 1 second. And that's because he wasn't in the business of setting the clock back 1 or 2 seconds. He wanted to guide progress. He wanted to work with history to move the world in a progressive and liberal direction. And he once said, I think, that socialism seeks to pull the world down, seeks to pull down wealth. Liberalism seeks to raise up poverty. Socialism would kill enterprise. Liberalism would rescue enterprise from the trammels of privilege and preference. And I think rescuing enterprise from the trammels of privilege and preference was right at the heart of what he wanted to do. And of course, the overwhelming case for Churchill is that he stood and destroyed the greatest of all threats to the liberal social order, which is Nazism, which was Hitler. And in doing this, he saved liberal society from inevitable and terrible destruction. It's very easy to forget how now, from our privileged position, how popular appeasement was in the 1930s, how popular appeasement was with the left because of the legacy of the First World War and not wanting to repeat the horrors of the First World War, and with some elements on the right, such as Chips Channon, how popular it is with people who actually sympathised with Hitler. And Churchill stood from the very first against this. From the very first, he grasped that this was a war between liberalism and barbarism, and that barbarism couldn't be allowed to win. He stood on his own for a long time. He then, when he took control of the Conservative Party, kept England fighting Hitler on his own for a very long time. He electrified the country. He restored the morale of the country at a terrible time in Europe. And he understood that the only way to win was to bring the Americans into the war, which he carefully did. And he won that war more than anybody else. If it hadn't been for Churchill, the Nazi regime would have lasted for a decade, 2 decades. We might even now be teaching eugenics and racial science in the schools of the Western world. So this was an overwhelming case, I think. He then goes on to identify the next great enemy, which was, of course, Bolshevism, communism, and to lay down the building blocks of the Cold War. He invents, or at least popularizes the phrase Cold War, invents or at least popularizes the phrase Iron Curtain. He keeps he builds the building blocks of the Cold War, and understands that our greatest attribute, our greatest benefit in the West is patience and time. He doesn't push too quickly, but he does push quickly enough to build the basic building blocks, as I say, of resistance to communism. And above all, I think he embodies the most important thing about liberalism, which is that politics isn't everything. Politics is something that should lead to a civilized society. And I think of all our candidates, he is the one who is most civilized. He writes an extraordinary amount in this fantastic Augustan sort of prose. He's an excellent painter. He does some wonderful paintings. He's a sort of landscape architect. And he's a wonderful person to sort of listen to. He's caused more laughter than any of these other people, certainly more laughter than Peel, who was a bit of a bore, frankly, and certainly more laughter than Mrs. Thatcher. And I think to have two great claims, to have the claim that you saved the world from Nazism, and that you had enough energy and humour left over when you'd done that to be the sort of person one would want to sit next to at dinner, certainly more than one would want to sit next to Gladstone or Mrs. Thatcher, I think is absolutely final evidence that this was the greatest of all our Liberal prime ministers.
Thank you, Adrian. And to the audience, could you send us questions that you have about these and future speeches in the chat function, and they will be put to our speakers during the Q&A session. Charles, I'm sure you did sit next to Mrs. Thatcher at dinner. Could you tell us why she is the greatest?
Yes, I did, and Adrian's quite wrong to say that she wasn't fun. She had the most incredible spark. She didn't make male type jokes, but she was tremendous fun. Dan said that he laboured under disadvantages because Peel was so long ago. I think Mrs. Thatcher labours under disadvantages because she's so recent, and this audience will almost all have a living memory of her, and that will mean that they have more of a formed view already. And of course, people don't think of her as a liberal because she was a capital C conservative, and in some ways a genuine small c conservative. Also, of course, as you've said, Emma, she's a liberal means something else nowadays to a lot of people. And obviously, Mrs. Thatcher is not a liberal in the sense that Hillary Clinton, let alone Kamala Harris, is. So I have quite a case to build, but I can assert with complete confidence that Mrs. Thatcher was a liberal in the classical sense. And she believed in, and said it repeatedly, liberty, but not just liberty, law-based liberty. Quite soon after she'd become leader of the party, she rather surprised her office one day by stumping into the office at great speed, as she always did, and banging down on the table a copy of F.A. Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty. "This is what we believe," she said. And this was not the sort of thing Tories traditionally, it sounded a bit too passionate and a bit too ideological, but it was what she believed. And she believed that liberty wasn't just some fine ideal, it was the foundation of a just society. And it was also the model for individual conduct, the basis of individual conduct. Choice, she said, is the essence of ethics, and she wanted to make sure that we were free to choose. And in the 1970s, this was actually quite a sort of heretical and subversive doctrine, because she was asserting that we were losing liberty because of the direct interference of government in economic life and because of not confronting Soviet communism. So she wanted to make this the most old-fashioned party in a way, an hierarchical party, to take on a new purpose. This is not a fight for privilege, she said, it's a fight for freedom, freedom for every citizen. And to her, this was the active organizing principle of all her politics. And so, for example, it greatly affected her alliances and her belief in what they could do, of which the most important was with the United States. And she'd already befriended Ronald Reagan before he or she held office. And when she won in 1979, then he became president in 1981, he wrote to her and said, "You are indeed right that we share a very special concern for democracy and liberty." This was a very powerful liberal alliance. Things were so bad in the 1970s that Mrs. Thatcher concentrated on economic questions most in relation to liberty. Inflation was taking away savings, nationalization was getting rid of competition, and tax was getting rid of enterprise. Trade union leaders could act politically without democratic elections, without strike votes, and with legal immunities. So how on earth could Britain recover, she would ask, if we have no freedom to act, because it's in freedom that we can act our best. And if you look through all the smoke of conflict, and there were a lot of casualties under Mrs. Thatcher in that conflict, you can see her order of battle. 1, control government spending. 2, get rid of those union immunities and introduce democratic secret ballots in trade unions. And then her great principle often said as her slogan, every earner an owner. So she gave council house tenants, that's public housing tenants, for those the non-British members of the audience, the right to buy their tenanted houses. And she sold off enormous numbers, scores of nationalized industries, including British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, selling the shares in them at an advantage to their staff. And so she brought privatization to the world. And just to bring home one or two effects of these liberal measures, and I think it is the actual effects of them which makes her so powerful. She actually did so many things. In 1979, only 3 million citizens in Britain owned shares. When she left in 1990, 11 million owned shares. And in that period, 2 million council houses were bought by their tenants. And in 1979, 29 million working days were lost to strikes. And in 1990, fewer than 2 million were lost to strikes. So these measures had an overwhelming and intended liberalizing effect, the only sustained attempt to do that in Britain in the 20th century. And with them came other freedoms, getting rid of prices and incomes policy and price controls, cutting income tax rates at all levels from 80% to 40% in the case of the top. Big bang in the City of London. Little things like you made it possible to shop on Sunday, whereas before, due to weirdly anomalous restrictions, it had been illegal to buy a Bible on the Christian Sabbath, but perfectly legal to buy pornography. And she got rid of exchange controls in the first months. The prison doors, she boldly declared, had been thrown open. The separate but related was everything about the Cold War. She believed, and this was sort of new actually, new with Reagan, that it could be won. First of all, through the strengthening the nuclear deterrent. Secondly, by bargaining from strength with, once Gorbachev emerged, which she persuaded Reagan to engage with, but also on quite another level, which was to engage with the people. She believed that the people of the Eastern Bloc, she believed, as liberals always do, that freedom is a universal value and that people want it. And she reached out to the people of Russia, Hungary, Poland, and so on, and was enormously popular and successful in her visits there as a result. Her most famous sobriquet was given to her by her enemies. She made a speech in 1976 against détente because the Russians, she felt, were cheating. And the Red Star, the Red Army newspaper, famously called her the Iron Lady. To them, it was an obvious joke and in contempt of her, because how could a lady be iron? But she could see that this was a great compliment, and she turned it round against them. She grabbed this, and she, suitably dressed for the occasion, she spoke, and she said, "I stand before you tonight in my Red Star chiffon evening gown, my face softly made up, and my fair hair gently waved, the Iron Lady of the Western world. Yes, I am an Iron Lady, if that's how they wish to interpret my defense of freedoms and values fundamental to our way of life." Before she left office, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Not only was Margaret Thatcher an Iron Lady, she was also, where freedom from tyranny is concerned, the Iron Liberal.
Fantastic, Charles. Thank you. Now, we are still expecting that Michael Gove may turn up in a few minutes. So I'm going to take some questions before then, and we will have Gladstone presented by one of our two possible representatives at about 6:12. We've had a fantastic lot of questions in, and I'm actually going to start with one for you, Charles, about Thatcher. From Anonymous, who says, didn't Thatcher condemn a large chunk of the British public to long-term unemployment? Didn't her pursuit of individualism lead to the decline of communities and the promotion of a culture of greed? How would you respond to that, Charles?
Well, it certainly, I don't think it was to long-term unemployment, because having gone up early in her period, it went down later in her period because of the liberalizing measures, greater productivity, and so on. On the whole question about greed, and Mrs. Thatcher was famously said, "There's no such thing as society," but nobody paid attention to what she meant by that, what she went on to say, which is that there are individual people and there are families, and it is our duty to help one another in that context. So what she was saying was, what does society composed of? You can't blame everything on this thing called society. You are part of it, and you have tremendous responsibilities towards it. And that, I think, was the essence of her liberalism, actually. We have the freedom, we have the choice, and we must act in the interests of society by making those choices rather than delegating them. I think that's a very important, fundamentally liberal idea.
Thanks, Charles. Adrian, there's one for you. Well, actually, there are several for you, but the one I'm going to give you at the moment is, again, from an anonymous person. If Churchill was so fickle in his party affiliation, how can we be sure if he was a liberal, if he wasn't sure himself?
I think the opposite is true. I think that Churchill, strangely enough, was very fickle in his parliamentary associations precisely because he was very fixed in his fundamental values. So you have people like, I would say, Baldwin, who was very fickle in his fundamental values, but always stuck to the Conservative line. Churchill, the opposite. He shifted from party to party precisely because parties change, but Churchill's fundamental ideas did not change. And those fundamental ideas were rooted in freedom, freedom modified by circumstances, particularly by the rise of the new liberalism, but always an opposition to tyranny and always an opposition to the overwhelming might of the state if it was being used to crush individual liberty. So the great themes of fighting unjustified state coercion whilst also supporting a little bit more of an active state in order to provide health, welfare, and the rest of it, are very, very consistent themes. So what he said to old Curly Malilu was exactly right. He was a liberal and always had been. Politics had changed around him, but he hadn't changed.
Very good, Adrian. Another one for you, I'm afraid, because there are a few on this theme. Do Churchill's morally reprehensible views on race / his policies towards India undermine his potential to be the greatest liberal prime minister, since it contradicts the argument for equality regardless of race?
Churchill's views on race are very complicated. They're not that different from the common view of late Victorian people on the subject of race. In other words, there was a very strong element of belief that the white races were the superior races, and Churchill shared that belief. Churchill, however, is very unusual for his times in being he's very philo-Semitic at a time when in his class and in the wider culture, anti-Semitism was quite common. Churchill was definitely not of that kind. Churchill's view on India was more romantic than race-based. I think if you really want to go for racial theories at this time, you go for the left rather than the right. You go to people like the Webbs. You go for people like George Bernard Shaw. There was a very strong element of scientific racism on the left of society at that time. Churchill's views are more unthinking and more romantic about the English-speaking peoples than sort of tainted by that scientism. On India, I think he was stubborn on the subject of India in the 1930s, very much opposed to giving it dominion status. But in fact, that turned out to be not so foolish, because I think India's involvement in the Second World War was absolutely vital and an incredible part of the empire. And whatever one can say of what Churchill did about race, thought about race, or sometimes said about race, whatever you can say about what he did about opposing dominion status for India, what he understood was the thing, the fundamental thing, that Nazism was the greatest ever threat to liberal civilization, and that it had to be opposed. And it had to be opposed absolutely, without question, from the first, without compromise. It couldn't be compromised with, and you had to push through that opposition regardless of the cost. Victory at any cost to you. And I think that if he said a few terrible things, the fact that he destroyed Hitler more than justifies those terrible things.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm just going to warn all of you that there's a question, there are several general questions, and there's one I rather like that I'm going to throw at a couple of you after I've asked the next one, which is, which of the leaders, if they could be installed today, would be the best to deal with the current issues that face Britain? But first, I'm going to give Margaret one, which I rather like, from Hugo, which is, what lessons can we learn from David Lloyd George as Britain looks for a new role in the world?
I think perhaps one of the things that marked his career, and I think we can learn, is his flexibility. He came, of course, very new to foreign affairs, and his critics always said he didn't really understand it. But I think that actually gave him an openness of mind. And he was prepared to challenge the Foreign Office. He was prepared to challenge traditional views of the way the British did things. And I think he grasped early on, as Churchill did as well, the importance of the United States. And I think he knew that sooner or later, this enormously potential power, as it was in 1918, but a power in the process of becoming actual, tremendous economic, demographic, and potential military power, was something that Britain was going to have to deal with. And I think he understood that very early on and had a great deal of admiration. One of his prized possessions was a death mask of President Lincoln, whom he admired enormously. And so I think if he were alive today and if he were prime minister, he would be saying, I think, to the British Foreign Office, because he didn't always listen to the Foreign Office, you have to rethink what you're doing. I think he would have pushed the Integrated Defence and Security Review a lot further to come up with a grand national strategy for Britain. I think he would have been looking for potential allies around the world. And he would have been flexible. He would have been prepared to deal with the Chinese. He was not doctrinaire, and I think that was one of his great strengths.
Hello.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Daniel, how do you think Peel would do in today's Britain? Do you think he'd be a good leader for us now?
Well, I can probably best answer that by again quoting The Economist's most famous writer, Walter Bagehot, when he said he was fitted to work and explain, not to charm or to amuse. The one thing that supporters and opponents all agreed about is that Peel had an extraordinary capacity to get his mind around the details of a subject and deliver. I think that would have made him an extremely apt prime minister to our current discontents with the coronavirus and the lockdown. I think he would have been instinctively of the view that voluntary measures were better than full state coercion. I think he'd have been a very mild lockdown skeptic. He'd have wanted to have used the full force of coercive power as likely as possible. I think it's also worth saying one other thing if we're talking about the stories of today. Something else that Bagehot credited him for, and again, Bagehot was not a sort of natural admirer, was creating a relatively uncorrupt political system out of what had previously been a system where, to a large degree, state offices were treated as private property. And he never liked to give preferment or sinecures to anyone, even to his closest friends and family. There was a letter written after he died about how his nephew's father had been pushing for very small jobs for them. And he said, look, Peel just wouldn't hear of it. He loved them. He would take them shooting with him. He was the most generous fellow, but he absolutely wouldn't countenance abuse of office. And I think those two qualities, extraordinary administrative skill and sea green incorruptibility, would have fitted him remarkably well to the modern age.
Excellent. Charles, do you think Margaret Thatcher would be the woman for today? I mean, given that she is responsible for some of the geographic economic inequality we have that Boris Johnson is trying to deal with through levelling up, do you think she'd be the right woman for us?
Well, in a way, the disadvantage I referred to earlier is now more of in this question, more of an advantage to Mrs. Thatcher, because we, unlike with the other people in the debate, we know what she thought about where Britain ought to be going. And this has been achieved with Brexit, because in her later years, she became a believer in Brexit, though she didn't know the word. She died before the word was coined. But from about 1990, she came to the view that we should leave the European Union, and she knew why. And she foresaw, through her opposition to the single currency, almost everything that went wrong in the development of the European Union in this century. So I think she'd be well placed to make it happen and make it work. Better placed than any other, in fact.
Thank you, Charles. I'm delighted to say we've got Michael with us now, who can tell us about Gladstone.
Emma, everyone, thank you so much. I'm here to represent the late William Ewart Gladstone, and my apologies for being tardy in joining this debate. But in a way, while I can acknowledge the greatness of all the other prime ministers who are here, if you want someone who is a great Liberal prime minister, who symbolises in everything that they did in their political career the virtues of liberalism, then you have to acknowledge that William Ewart Gladstone is the genius who incarnates all of those virtues. Throughout the 19th century, Victorian liberalism, high Victorian liberalism, was characterised by three things: peace, retrenchment, and reform. And I think any liberal today would say that those three watchwords, those three guiding principles, are what social, economic, and other liberals can recognise as the core of the creed. Let me just look at what Gladstone achieved in office. When we think about reform, long before he was Prime Minister, he was already one of the most successful domestic reformers in our history, if not the most successful. So when he was a junior minister under Peel, he essentially made sure that our national railway structure could operate effectively to power the economic growth that we saw later in the 19th century. It's also the case that when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he had a time as Chancellor of the Exchequer under two different prime ministers, we saw some of the most successful administrative reforms in this country's history. The Northcote Trevelyan reform, which created a civil service based on merit, the finest civil service in the world, that was Gladstone's legacy as Chancellor of the Exchequer in terms of domestic reform. He went on as Prime Minister to extend those same principles of meritocracy to the army by ending the purchase of commissions. He also succeeded in pushing forward political reform by extending the franchise more than any other individual has ever done. And at the same time, he was also responsible for the biggest single education reform, the Foster Education Act, which ensured that universal education and an end to the patchwork quilt of patronage and prejudice that had existed beforehand, that was all down to him. But as well as all of these administrative reforms, which transformed our society from the Regency world of privilege and status to a world of merit and efficiency, it was also the case, as Chancellor of the Exchequer and subsequently as Prime Minister, that he was an economic radical sans pareil. Peel, of course, was brave and heroic in recognising the need for the repeal of the Corn Laws. But if one looks at the number of duties that Gladstone reduced, the way in which he refrained from borrowing but ensured that taxation was spread fairly and equally, Gladstone was the embodiment of classical liberalism in economics, and he recognised that by reducing indirect taxation, by reducing duties, he was responsible for making sure that the workman's table was unburdened by this additional cost, and therefore he was the godfather of not just liberty but economic growth. And it is striking, of course, at a time when we're looking for free trade agreements, that Gladstone secured a free trade agreement with France, one of the most successful of the 19th century. But he didn't just believe in a mercantilist approach towards free trade agreements. He believed in lowering duties overall, making sure that the income tax was broadly based but low, and also making sure that individuals looked to themselves for their economic salvation. And he was deeply sceptical of attempts by government to over-intervene in the economic space because he believed in liberating the creativity and the animal spirits of the individual. Peace? Well, of course, Gladstone was, Lloyd George, Churchill, great war leaders. But actually the supreme act of statesmanship for any liberal is to avoid conflict. And that is what Gladstone sought to do. Yes, he would call out the cynicism of Disraeli when the Ottomans and their Bashi bazooks were causing horrendous atrocities in Bulgaria. But above all, rather than the vainglorious Disraelian approach of expanding the empire and expending blood and treasure, he believed in controlling the growth of the empire, avoiding, wherever possible, external conflicts, and concentrating on domestic prosperity and on peace. One thing that many people know about Gladstone is, of course, his nocturnal activities. He's sometimes accused of being priggish and hypocritical. Not at all. What Gladstone was doing in every sphere of his life was living, as he saw it, a Christian life. And this, I think, is one of the most important things. The clue to Gladstone's approach. His liberalism was based on a very Christian sense that each individual was of unique worth. That if government got out of the way, if you had a simple meritocratic approach towards preferment, then we could ensure that individuals could achieve not just their full sense of fulfillment, but they could play a part in the modernization of a country. And I think it is the case if one looks at essentially at the high Victorian Middle Age and towards the end of the 19th century, all of the foundations of British success, the best armed forces, the best civil service, the best economic policy, free trade evangelism, all of those things, Gladstone is the progenitor and godfather of. The grand old man is the man for today if you're a liberal.
Thank you, Michael. Fantastic. I'm going to keep you here a second because the question that I was putting to people, which came up on our Q&A just before you arrived, is how would your Prime Minister do faced with the challenges of today? Do you think Gladstone would have been the man to deal with COVID, the fallout from Brexit, levelling up? How do you think he'd have managed the 21st century?
Brilliantly. The first thing to say is that when it comes to the economic challenges that we face, Gladstone was one of the most fiscally responsible, but also growth-creating chancellors of the Exchequer and Prime Ministers that there has ever been. We were living, or this country was living, through a time of roiling social tension when Gladstone came onto the political stage. Chartism, agitation, difficulties in our industrial areas, but he was able to hand on to his successors an economic powerhouse, the strongest in the world. And he did so by following very clear economic principles, which ensured that the individual pound would fructify in every Englishman or Welshman's or Scotswoman's pocket. And by cleaving to those economic principles, he was able, at a time of social tension, to create a greater sense of prosperity. And in particular, what is really striking is that Gladstone, by sticking to classical liberal economic principles, became a hero of the working class. Because what he was doing was providing them with the means, the wherewithal, the route to control over their destiny. So he would have been the Prime Minister for Economic Recovery and the Prime Minister for Levelling Up. But the other thing, of course, is that one of the consequences of COVID is that we've seen that there are parts of the way in which the state operates that need reform. We need to look at the backlog in the NHS. We need to look at the need for greater educational recovery. We need to look at the very machinery of government itself. And there is no one who has a record of success in reforming every part of the state to compare with Gladstone's. So whether, as I say, it's the civil service, education, the military, there's no one in history who has that record, and therefore no one who would be better equipped to have the vision required now for the scale of this challenge.
Thanks, Michael. Margaret, how do you think Lloyd George would have done today?
Again, I think, as he would have done in foreign policy, I think he would have done very well, because one of the great things he did was to reach outside the normal channels to look for people who could advise him. And so when he was president of the Board of Trade, or when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he brought in experts, he brought in people from business for advice. When he was Minister of Munitions during the war, he overhauled that whole ministry and made it possible for the British to go on fighting. And he cooperated with business and he cooperated with experts. He believed in going for the very best people, no matter where he found them. And I think what he would have done today, he would have gone, as the government did sometimes, to people outside government itself to find the people who knew about epidemics, epidemiology, to find someone like you know, the people who did the procurement of vaccines. I think this would have been something he would have been very good at, because he was never stuck in doing things in a particular way. He had a very open mind, I think perhaps possibly because he hadn't had a very traditional career. He had come up really by his own merits. He hadn't gone to university, he had educated himself. I think he was very, very flexible. And I think when you face something like a pandemic or a major world war, you need that sort of flexibility. You cannot go on doing business as usual. And I think he would have been someone who would have grasped the importance, as he grasped the challenges of the First World War very early on. I think before his own Prime Minister Asquith did, he grasped those challenges. And I think in the very early days of the pandemic, he would have said, we're dealing with something very different here, and we need to mobilize as much as we can the talents, the abilities, the resources of this country. And he would have worked, as he did in the First World War and as he did afterwards, with other countries, with other leaders, to try and come up with common policies. I think he would have been someone who would have coped extremely well, because in some ways, the similarities shouldn't be pushed too far, but in some ways, a major world war is like a major pandemic. And Lloyd George had that capacity to swing into action and to deal with it.
Adrian, do you think that Churchill would have done better in our peacetime than he did in peacetime after the war?
I don't think he did particularly badly in peacetime after the war. He understood that the most important thing after the war was to develop a strategy to contain the expansion of Soviet communism. And I think that was a very, very important thing to do. I think there are two reasons why. I think the thing about Churchill was he was exceptionally good at identifying the big problems and focusing on the big problems. And I think in the 1910s, he saw that the big problem was redesigning the state for an era of new and more interventionist liberalism, which he focused on. We need that sort of energy now to redesigning the state for a new era of technology and a new set of problems. He also recognized that there were two fundamental threats that had to be dealt with. First of all, Nazism, and then Soviet communism. And now we have another massive, massive threat on the horizon, which is an expansionist, aggressive, totalitarian, and amoral China. And I think he would have focused on that with an absolute passion and would have directed, the whole of the world, the free world's efforts to dealing with this problem. And the other thing that he had, the extraordinary thing that he had, was energy. When he came to Downing Street during the Second World War, he electrified the place. It was rather lethargic. at the time, and he just got things done. He exhausted his secretaries with notes. He exhausted his military commanders with ideas. He had these notes that he put everywhere. To be done today, business to be done today, and and change the country as well as the machinery of government with that energy. So I think he identified the really big problems and threw himself into solving those problems. So I think he's the man today as well as he was the man for the 1940s.
Thank you. So I've got another interesting question here from Edward Somerville, who wants to know how the candidates would now handle the question of saving the union. Michael, I know this is a question that you may have applied some thought to. How do you think Gladstone would have gone about saving the union?
Well, Gladstone was a visionary. It was the case that even at the risk of party unity, he recognised that there needed to be reform of the way in which the union worked. His mission, as he stated after his first premiership, was to pacify Ireland, and he recognised that the nature of the political relationship between this island and Ireland could only be resolved if we recognised the unique nature of the political culture there, which required home rule, as it was then called, devolution, as we would now call it, to work. And what Gladstone was seeking to do was to, in the best liberal fashion, find a timely way of meeting particular concerns that would allow men and women of goodwill to coalesce around the principle of working together. Now, I think most people would conclude that it was a failure to ensure, actually, that this situation was dealt with in a timely, proportionate and balanced way that led to some of the pain and stress which was visited upon Ireland later. And again, I don't want to cast aspersions on other candidates before us, but both Churchill and Lloyd George in the period after the First World War tried a policy of repression in Ireland, which was nothing if not illiberal. And so I think in that sense, Gladstone would have been well equipped to do it. The other thing is that Gladstone was a genuine Great Britain. Born in Liverpool, family home in Farsk in Deeside, someone who appreciated the potent importance of Welsh liberalism and Welsh radicalism in making sure that you had a truly united political party. I don't think that there have been many political movements that have been as successful in securing representation across the United Kingdom as the Victorian Liberal Party were. So I think it's believing in the ideal of Britain, recognising that together we're stronger, but also recognising that you need slightly different institutions in slightly different parts of the United Kingdom to make it work, that would have made him the preeminent person to address this question of all of the candidates before us.
You don't think he'd have gone for home rule for Scotland?
Well, I think home rule already exists in Scotland. So there is, Scotland has devolution, and I think that Gladstone would have been a passionate supporter of making sure that the Westminster Parliament and subsidiary bodies, as he envisaged a home rule parliament in Dublin, worked together successfully. So in that sense, I think that he was ahead of his time, as he was in so many areas. But it's also the case that Gladstone recognised and worked within a Westminster system in which there were people of talent from every part of the United Kingdom. As I say, the whole point about the Victorian Liberal Party in Gladstone's day is that it was the party that best represented political traditions from Northern Ireland to the rest of what we now think of as the Republic, manifestly to Wales and to Scotland as well. It was the quintessence of a unionist party, and the whole point about the United Kingdom is its strength flows from A, that recognition of strength through diversity, but B, the fact that the Westminster Parliament is where we come together as a family of nations to resolve the issues that really matter.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Now, I've got to, I have the pleasure of asking you to vote. You should get a poll on your Zoom, and you've got 3 minutes to vote. And while you're doing that, I wanted to offer you some snippets from The Economist's coverage of these prime ministers. But the Victorians didn't really do sound bites. So I struggled a bit in the 19th century. Golly, they did sonorous prose there. So I thought you might enjoy some passages from the paper's obituary of Robert Peel. The date, 1850, means that it must have been written by James Wilson, the paper's founder, not by his son-in-law and successor, Walter Bagehot, who's reckoned to be our greatest editor. So the obit starts, a great vacancy has been made in the state. A great public loss has been sustained. A man whose name has been on everybody's lips for a quarter of a century, who has filled for upwards of 40 years a large space in the public estimation, has been suddenly taken away. Sir Robert Peel died on Tuesday night. And it's rather amazing reading this piece just because of the immediacy of it. The piece explains that he made an elaborate speech in the House of Commons on Friday. And on Saturday, he fell off his horse and he never recovered. And the piece then obviously focuses on the repeal of Corn Laws, the acts of his administration between 1842 and 1846, and speaks of how he fell from power, a sacrifice to his own convictions. But that was the only sacrifice, for all of the interests of the nation, without trouble or confusion, have thriven by the great change that he brought about. The drama in the piece, though, lies in his relationship with the Tory party. And we are left in no doubt about James Wilson's views of this institution. He writes, he was bred up in the ranks of that party of which he became the leader. He imbibed its tenets and regulated his political conduct by its principles. But they, though consecrated by time and some apparent success, were erroneous. And it was his misfortune that to succeed as a leading minister of a society making very rapid progress, he had to unlearn and counteract the errors of Toryism. The political creed in which he was nurtured has become, for this age, a glaring error. And of all men who imbibed it, he has the greatest merit in having got rid of it and having dared to act on his new convictions of right and duty. The paper was clearly worried that a bunch of hypocritical Tories had backed him while he was alive and would welsh on his principles now that he was dead. So the obit ends. Now that he has set by his death the seal to his doctrines, there can be no departure from them by those who have been his professed followers, without destroying reputation and dooming the backslider to enduring contempt, which is a great line. I think I shall probably be borrowing it for a future leader on the current lot of the Tories. So we've got some poll results now. Oh, interesting. I'm afraid you are slinging out of the basket. Margaret, I'm afraid you and Lloyd George are over the side. Adrian, you and Churchill are plummeting through the air. And I'm afraid, Charles, you and Margaret Thatcher are following them swiftly. And Peel and Gladstone are clinging on in the basket, which means that we'd like a final push on behalf of Peel, please, from Daniel. And thank you very, very much to all of the rest of you.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. Thank you to everyone who supported me. Can I just say, by the way, I love the fact that The Economist did this. I wish we had made space for the two candidates in the famous Simpsons bar brawl scene, Palmerston and Pitt the Elder, championed by Lenny and by Barney, the last great and patriotic Whig and the other the man who would have conciliated America and perhaps kept the English-speaking world together. But coming back to why you should vote, as it were, for the master rather than the man, for Peel rather than his disciple and successor. At this time, as we come out of the epidemic and its associated lockdowns, all of us face the most extraordinary struggle to win what has always been the core animating principle for The Economist, which is unrestricted commerce and enterprise. It's always difficult to win these arguments. It was difficult in Peel's time, in Gladstone's time. All of the candidates tonight were free traders, and all of them were struggling against public opinion. But when you get an epidemic, it throws people back onto their most basic caveman heuristics. They want to hoard food to get through the winter. They want to keep an eye on their children. They want to avoid strangers who might carry pathogens. And we have seen this feeding through into an upsurge in protectionist sentiment and protectionist policy worldwide. The number of people who have said to me over the last 12 months, surely, Hannon, even you can see that we need to grow more of our own food in this country. We've got to have food security, right? Sounds superficially enormously plausible. Disastrous policy when applied. You want a country that grows all its own food? North Korea, Juche, the supreme ruling principle of policy. Other end of the scale, Singapore doesn't produce an edible ounce, cheapest food in the world. That was the argument that Peel set out to win, against the weight of intuition, against the massed ranks of the Tory party just referred to in your editorial, against all of the landed interests who had turned the protectionist policy supposedly brought in for a contingency because of the Napoleonic Wars into a way of making a living at the expense of the wider country. And that ultimately is why he is the Prime Minister for our time. I'd like to close with a couple of things said by people who are not particularly warm in their praise, particularly of politicians. First, the Duke of Wellington, very hardline, old school Tory, who was reduced almost to tears when he spoke about Peel in the House of Lords. And he said, "I never knew a man in whose truth and justice I had a more lively confidence, or in whom I saw a more invariable desire to promote the public service." Queen Victoria, you remember if you watched the programme about her, she was not a Peelite in any sense. She manoeuvred in all sorts of ways, but she said, and I think this is very touching, she said, everyone seems to have lost a personal friend. There were huge outpourings, public demonstrations of grief when Peel passed in 1850, because he was seen to have been the man who stopped the racket whereby the poor supported the rich and restored the country to its people.
Daniel, fantastic. Thank you. Now, Michael, Daniel has done a really powerful job of lifting your feet off the floor of the basket. I can see you are teetering on the edge. Are you going to cling on there by your fingernails and tip him over instead?
Well, I would have no wish to tip Peel over, because Daniel is right. Peel was a politician of rare courage. And his decision, influenced, of course, by Cobden, Bright and others, to repeal the Corn Laws, set the scene for this country's revival and renewal in the high Victorian age. But Peel was essentially a John the Baptist figure, a brave man and a great man, but he laid the foundations for his inheritor, for Gladstone, to transform the country more dramatically. So while Peel changed one law, Gladstone abolished countless duties in order to reconfigure the taxation system of this country in order to promote personal liberty. And Peel, of course, was economically courageous. Gladstone was economically sweepingly radical. And exactly because he was so sweepingly radical, he secured the mandate, the authority, and the intellectual weight to go beyond simply the economic sphere. And this is where Gladstone moves from being the inheritor of Peel to being undoubtedly a much more significant liberal figure. Because what he did is to apply the principles of liberalism to the administration of government. He made sure through reforms of the civil service and the military, as I mentioned earlier, and also the extension of the franchise, that our whole political culture was transformed. Peel was essentially, as we know, a figure from the age of Wellington and Canning and so on, who was a herald of liberalism, but it was the case that Gladstone was the engineer of all of the institutions which promoted the liberalism that went on to be the contributor to this country's finest hours and greatest successes. The other thing also is that Gladstone was courageous on so many issues. Courageous in taking on Disraeli and denouncing the Bulgarian massacres. Courageous in attempting to pacify Ireland, even at the cost of support from within his own party. Courageous in making sure that people knew, when he stood at the dispatch box as Chancellor of the Exchequer, that he was making a case not on a narrow basis of political economy, but as part of a more expansive and broader view of what humans, individuals could achieve if liberated to be their best. And if we think about the sadness that attended Gladstone's passing, in his final cabinet, when he stood down in order to be succeeded, as it were, by Rosebery, everyone around that cabinet table looked at one another and they knew that an age and a titan was passing. They knew that there would be no political figure, and there hasn't been, to accomplish such a dramatic change to every part of Britain as Gladstone did. And he did that because he was fired by a moral energy, and in particular, he was fired by a belief as to what this country could accomplish if only it followed those principles which he'd imbibed as a young man in the Christian culture of his family in Liverpool, that if you trust and believe in individuals and if you value them, then you can ensure that prosperity and human flourishing flow.
Thank you, Michael. Now, you, the audience, it's time for you to decide whether Michael and Gladstone or Daniel and Peel get to cling on in the basket. So back to the voting, please. You've got another 3 minutes. And back to the obits. So Gladstone got one in a similar vein to Peel's, which does support very much what Michael was saying. So there is scarcely a measure of reform of the last half century with which his honoured name was not conspicuously associated. To reckon his achievements is to enumerate almost everything that took place in English political history during that era. It was not that and then it kind of comes to life rather nicely and one starts to like Gladstone. It was not that he merely associated himself with a measure of reform. He threw his whole soul into it. He urged its claims in season and out of season. He defended it with masterly intellect and passionate enthusiasm. In this way, he threw a halo of romance on the dingy arena of political strife. The paper clearly feels that it needs to touch on his terribly long and boring speeches, but does so very tactfully. It says his speeches will not, perhaps, prove of permanent interest, but it is enough that they serve their purpose. It has been truly said that the object of Demosthenes was not to make people say, what a fine speaker Demosthenes is, but to make them exclaim, let us march against Philip. And this was precisely the effect of Mr. Gladstone's oratory. It had reference to immediate duty. Now, things take a very different turn in the 20th century. What then becomes interesting to me is not so much the obits, but the lack of them. So Lloyd George gets 2 paragraphs in the paper with quite a nice tear-jerking finale. As an Englishman, he belongs to the very select company of the eternal names, Elizabeth, Cromwell, Marlborough, Chatham, Pitt, Wellington and Gladstone. But he was not an Englishman. He died where his spirit belonged, in the hills of Snowdonia, and as a Welshman, he was the greatest of them all. But the really weird thing is that Churchill gets 5 paragraphs, most of which are actually about Harold Wilson. Which does suggest to me there was something weird going on in the 20th century. And maybe that the Economist journalist, perhaps like much of the country, spent quite a lot of the 20th century kind of wanting to put the past behind it. The only quote from Churchill in the piece, which seems to me utterly bizarre, given the power of his prose, is "on with the job." Thatcher gets her proper due in a shocking great piece that Adrian wrote, of which my favourite line is, "The quickest way to her political convictions was usually through her handbag." As she prepared to make her first leader's speech to the Conservative Party conference in 1975, a speechwriter tried to gee her up by quoting Abraham Lincoln. "You cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You cannot bring about prosperity by discouraging thrift. You cannot help the wage earner by pulling down the wage payer. When he'd finished, Mrs. Thatcher fished into her handbag to extract a piece of aging newsprint with the same lines on it. "It goes wherever I go," she told him. Oh, the poll results, which I was expecting to have had in now, we haven't yet got. We've had 1,500 votes, so you're clearly quite keen on this one, and I'm very glad of it. Some of our earlier judgments on Thatcher, by the way, were quite a lot dodgier. Our first mention of her is when she got her first ministerial job in 1961 as a junior minister in the Department for Pensions, and we said she only got it because she was a woman. So, we've got the final votes. And Daniel, I'm afraid you and Peel are over the edge of the basket, and Michael and Gladstone are triumphantly raising their fists together, floating up. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, very much. Thank you for watching this event. You can see the future events we'll be holding by clicking on the link below. You'll also see previous events we've hosted, including one on what the next decade will bring for climate change, and a conversation between our editor, Zanny Minton Beddoes, and Ursula Burns, former CEO of Xerox.